Dr. Paul Saladino has shared over the years why a carnivore diet did not work for him and why, in actuality, that a carnivore or ketogenic diet would not work or is ideal for many. In this video, I am going to share why I believe Paul Saladino is wrong and what I think are the root cause issues.
One of the key things that I learned in my journey from carnivore strictly to animal-based, that adding carbohydrates in improved my hormones, as you'll see, my thyroid, my testosterone. It improved my muscle cramps. It improved my mental clarity. It improved cardiac issues like heart palpitations, which are related to electrolyte issues. It improved so many things. I think I have a fasting blood sugar from when I was on carnivore. They're usually high 90s or hundreds because there is some physiologic insulin resistance, which is different than pathologic insulin resistance that develops when we are on a ketogenic diet. These are the reasons that I am not a fan of ketogenic diets. I don't think that they serve us well long-term as humans. I do think that all humans benefit from some carbohydrates, even if you're obese, even if you're diabetic, even if you're overweight. Getting around 100 grams of carbohydrates a day minimum will lower stress hormones, things like cortisol, catecholamines, including epinephrine and norepinephrine. 100 grams of carbohydrates will take some of the stress hormones out of the equation, which I think will benefit you long-term as a human.
If you're listening to this on podcast, I highly recommend watching this on video as I share a lot of infographics and a lot of information that will also most likely help you. Get ready. This video is a few years coming, and I finally got to sit down and share with you all why Dr. Paul Saladino is wrong about the carnivore diet. Hey guys, my name is Judy Cho and I'm board certified in holistic nutrition, and I have a private functional medicine practice where we focus on root cause healing, and we have worked with over 2,000 carnivore clients and patients get closer to root cause healing. And we often start with the Carnivore Cures all meat elimination diet. I know that Paul really believes that the carnivore diet didn't work for him, and that is why he needed to add a lot more fruit, honey, raw milk, and I guess now he drinks fruit juice. But I am here to tell you why his synthesis, his overall analysis is wrong. Now, I wanted to lay a few ground rules to make sure that we are on the same page when I'm using certain terminologies, because if we don't understand the same words, then we're not going to understand the same things. In many of the videos that Paul has brought up, he has shared that a ketogenic diet is not ideal for long term, and he shares why it's not recommended for pretty much anyone. When Paul defines a ketogenic diet, he is just saying that it means that there is pretty much zero carbs in the diet. I just want to make sure that he is not saying it's that you are in ketosis, that you have high ketones. He is saying that if you remove most to all carbs, that you are following a ketogenic diet. And so in that definition, a carnivore diet, a strict carnivore diet is a ketogenic diet. But a carnivore diet is safe and effective, and it's ideal for people that are suffering from metabolic syndrome and any types of inflammation, which is pretty much everybody these days. But the key is to eat sufficiently. Now, I don't think that everyone needs to eat carnivore or strict carnivore long-term, but you can eat strict carnivore long-term for short-term, for long-term, for however long you want to eat. And no one should be fear-mongered eating this way if you're eating sufficiently and you are supporting yourself by making sure you are tracking your symptoms as well as getting blood work occasionally. Now, in this video, while I'm sharing a lot of why I disagree with Paul, whether it's blood work, whether it's studies, I am also going to share some tidbits for you so that it will help you on your wellness journey. You'll get to see how our practice uses functional testing and why working one-on-one clinically is super important. Now, I am going to be going through a lot of labs, and I just want to make clear that labs are not only indicative of what you are eating. It also is impacted by sleep, stress, environment, and lots of other things that are happening in your life. Your food and your diet can absolutely impact markers, but it is not the only thing. So I just want to make that clear. Secondly, if there are markers that I don't necessarily disagree with Paul or that are not relevant to this conversation, I am not going to bring them up. Near the end of the conversation, I'll also share a little bit about fructose studies. I'm not going to dive into it deeply, but it is all to share that whatever study you want to find to prove your case, you can absolutely do that. Just because I know that Paul is super thorough, I just want to make sure that I am super thorough and making sure what the boundaries or the scope of this conversation is. I am not going to talk about anything organs related, vitamin A, PUFAs or polyunsaturated fatty acids, thyroid, repeat, pro-metabolic. As you can see here, I have done a lot of articles and some YouTube videos on it. I've done a very popular repeat review. Now, I did do one video where I analyzed what Paul was eating versus Dr. Sean Baker, and you can see my synthesis of why beef and liver doesn't work long term. But I will not go through specifically why I thought his version of carnivore was not ideal. But ultimately, I don't think he was eating sufficient fat. So if you want to see it, it will all be in the show notes. I also am not going to talk a lot about fructose. I have done numerous YouTube interviews and videos from experts, doctors, as well as going deep into articles, even talking about how much to eat on carnivore. So if you are eating a carnivore diet, oftentimes people will undereat, which will then impact their thyroid and hormone function. And they may undereat fat, which I think was part of the problem for the way that Paul was eating. Now, over the years, many of you have asked me, especially when I was sharing about vitamin A toxicity and a little bit of copper as well by eating too many organ meats or especially beef liver, you asked me to talk with Dr. Paul Saladino and do a debate. Well, it obviously never happened, but that reason was not because of me. So as you can see here, in June of 2023, I emailed Paul. And I think there was an email prior to this where I asked him to come on my podcast and that we can talk all things carnivore, fruit, etc. I've also messaged with him, but to no avail. Okay, so I know some of you are like, well, maybe Paul doesn't even get your messages. Maybe he doesn't even know you. Well, let me share something. So I am the graphic designer of the Carnivore Code book. You can see that this was his first original. I did the graphics for that book. Then we signed a contract for his book that was bought out by a separate publisher. And you can see here in his book, it says illustrations by Judy Cho. My story is in there. And then Paul had a note about me as well. In the Carnivore Code graphics, you could see all of these infographics. I worked with Paul to make this exactly how he wanted it to look. And this is his second version of the Carnivore Code where he changed some of the graphics. As an example, you could see here, he started adding the least toxic plants. Paul and I do have a personal relationship and we have worked together. And frankly, it would have saved us so much time if I just got on a podcast and had a friendly conversation with Paul. But since it didn't happen, I just wanted to clear the name of the carnivore diet. All right, so let's get into the crux of my argument. I want to talk about what standard care medical ranges are. We all get our blood work and we see the normal ranges. If it is out of range, you'll see a H or an L or a high or a low next to lab marker. But where do those ranges come from? Well, this is from Merck Manual, and it says the standard care ranges are statistical averages of otherwise healthy in the context of an analyte being measured. It includes people with subclinical health issues. So if somebody is pre-diabetic and checking their glucose, they would be part of that healthy population. But it says, while reference ranges do not usually allow 100% distinction between health and disease, they generally represent 95% of the otherwise healthy population. Again, this healthy population includes subclinical health issues. And Paul brought this up himself.
But I think that the important takeaway from the whole discussion is that labs might look a little different when we're eating a lot of meat, a lot of saturated fat from animals. And the context is critically important. I say that all the time, but what I mean by that is that if you are insulin sensitive, I think that a lot of things change and many portions of blood work get interpreted by well-meaning, intelligent physicians as if they are in a population of people who is massively insulin resistant. So yeah, for the run-of-the-mill physician seeing patients, for a physician, for a doctor seeing patients, they're just walking off the street, if they had some of the blood markers, specifically the LDL that I have, they might be concerned about their cardiovascular risk, but that person is insulin resistant.
So if we know that standard care is statistical averages of otherwise healthy, which includes subclinical health issues, let's look at averages of chronic illness in the US. 74% of Americans are overweight, 42% are obese, 60% have at least one chronic illness, 40% have two or more. Nearly half the US population has blood sugar regulation issues. Now, I just wanted to throw this in there as a tip, but 27.5% of US adults have high LDL, yet only 3% of the US adults have a heart attack. So maybe LDL is not the best marker to be tracking. The one thing to also note is that only 21% of Americans get annual blood work. This may be limited to the access of healthcare, maybe insurance, health issues. If 60% of Americans have chronic illness and then they're the ones that are getting blood work, could the average statistical range of blood work be skewed for a little bit more chronic illness? In functional medicine, we use functional medicine lab ranges. These ranges are from published research, clinical experience, and also consensus within the community. So if normally in the standard care range, up to the pink section is considered within range, the functional labs, we would end the range right here and right here. So the functional lab ranges are much tighter than the standard care ranges. Standard care, while they look at statistical averages, they will diagnose diseases and monitor progression, possibly getting you on drugs or having to use surgery where cells, tissues, and organs may be damaged. But functional ranges right here, so a tighter range of markers will help you stay in optimal health and allow you to be more proactive. Now, here's an example with triglycerides. The conventional range for triglycerides is 150 milligrams per deciliter. Now, we know in the carnivore community that ideally you want to be in the 100. So in the functional medicine range, you want to be between 50 to 100. Now, pro tip for some of the carnivores that are under eating fat and under eating in general, you actually want to be kind of between 60 and 100. And that's when I know a carnivore is eating sufficiently. I see way too many people that their markers are 45, 50, and it's oftentimes they are one, under eating, or two, they are under eating fat. So now I hope you guys understand what a functional medicine range is versus what the conventional blood work ranges is. When you wait until you are out of range for the conventional blood work ranges, you are risking disease that may be harder to heal. In our functional medicine practice, you could see this is how we look at it. You can see these optimal ranges, which we consider the functional medicine ranges, and then there's the standard ranges. So anything that's in yellow is considered out of optimal range, and anything in red is considered outside of the standard care range. I'm not going to go over this, but if you want to learn a little bit more between the conventional and functional labs and testing, you can pause this right here and just take a read. And so you know the nuance and differences.
But mostly I will discuss my recent blood work, which I just got a couple of weeks ago when I was in the United States. So late June 2022. The previous set of blood work was from late 2020, I believe. So it was a little less than 2 years. So it was too long, but I was doing a lot of traveling. So I've been doing different things with my diet, but for that entire time between the most recent set of blood work and this set of blood work, I've been animal-based. So the context for this blood work discussion is what I'm doing now with my diet. I eat meat about 2 pounds a day. I have a few ounces of different organs, heart, liver, that type of thing, testicle, bone marrow. I have fruit. So this is a new addition relative to my previous blood work discussions when I was strictly carnivore. So I have probably 200 plus grams of carbohydrates per day now from fruit and honey. So I'll discuss how that affects my blood sugars, how that affects my insulin sensitivity. So I have organs, I have meat, I have fruit, I have honey, and I have raw dairy, which I've been doing for probably about the last 6 to 7 months. I have raw butter. Occasionally I have raw cheese. I have raw milk from goats and cows, which I ferment into kefir. So that is the baseline. I don't eat bread. I don't eat vegetables. I don't eat grains. I don't eat beans. I don't eat starches. And those are the things that I leave out of my diet. Hemoglobin A1C, 5.2, fasting blood sugar, 79. These are all very, very good in my opinion. I don't think anyone would debate that I'm extremely insulin sensitive, that my fasting blood sugar is exemplary, and my hemoglobin A1C of 5.2 reflects an average blood sugar of 103 milligrams per deciliter over the last 90 days. This is important. So what do I want to talk about here? I want to note that with a massive amount, quote unquote, of fruit and honey in my diet, I remain extremely insulin sensitive. I don't think anyone would argue this. There are people on the keto side who would say honey is bad for you. And hopefully I'll be able to have conversations with them in the near future and talk it out in an interesting way. But I disagree. I think there's lots of good evidence that honey is great for humans. I've shown it many times on the podcast previously.
I did a video on why blood sugar goes up on a carnivore diet. And I talked about how to track symptoms and also check blood sugar levels. And I also mentioned tracking certain blood markers, including getting your NMR panel and looking at your LPIR score, which is a sign of insulin resistance. You can also get your C-peptide as well as your insulin, your fasting insulin, even though fasting insulin shifts a lot because it's a hormone. And I also shared a few studies where dolphins show insulin resistance when they are eating a carnivore diet. But once they eat a diet where they add carbs, their blood sugar normalizes. But is this a new normal? Because this is a different way of eating, and maybe our blood sugar is not being absorbed as quickly from the blood compared to somebody that's eating carbs. So of course, Paul's blood sugar is going to go down because the body is using it. If our blood sugar is naturally higher because we have less in store, that makes a reasonable response so that there's quicker access to the glucose when you don't have a lot stored in your liver. If your blood sugar goes up and you are feeling unwell, then that is a different story.
One way you can tell that you're insulin sensitive, one proxy is a high HDL and low triglycerides. I showed Framingham study data. What you saw was that people with the highest levels of HDL had essentially no relationship between LDL cholesterol and cardiovascular risk. HDL in that situation was a proxy for insulin sensitivity, or low HDL being a proxy for insulin resistance.
So I agree that many times if your HDL is higher and your triglycerides are low, that can be a sign of insulin sensitivity, but it is not always the case. And interestingly, Paul's 2024 blood work, that HDL to triglycerides gets impacted, but he doesn't bring it up in the 2024 blood work. This is a sample client of ours. And as you can see, her HDL is 82 and her triglycerides are 61. This, by any definition, would be considered super insulin sensitive and super healthy. Now, if you look down here, her insulin is 10.1 and her C-peptide is 3.1. Something is going on that her insulin is going up. And this person eats carnivore, but you can see here, while her lipid panel looks pretty good in a meat-based, healthy, insulin-sensitive way, she in fact is not insulin sensitive and something is going on. While the Framingham studies did show that, it is not always the case. High HDL and low triglycerides does not always equal insulin sensitivity. In fact, this blood work is pretty common within our carnivore patients. Now, they are suffering from some type of other chronic illness, but I'm just letting you know that your insulin can be high, even if your HDL and triglycerides look beautiful. And another pro tip, if your HDL is above 85, there can be a sign of inflammation. It is not good just to have super, super, super high HDL. We don't care as much about the blood sugar. We care about how the blood sugar is reflecting insulin. And as I showed you just earlier, that blood sugar can be normalized, your LDL can be normalized, but your insulin can be out of range. And so for Paul, because he's eating sugar, his insulin is obviously working right now to reduce it from the bloodstream and get it stored in the liver. If your insulin is low and you test all the other markers on a carnivore diet and your blood sugar is in the 90s, I don't think it's an issue. But that is a separate topic. What I do want to share is Paul's DHEA. So maybe Paul's testosterone went up, but his DHEA is actually very low. Conventional ranges are in orange. So if any of the markers are out of range, they will be in orange, and it will be because they're out of the conventional range levels. The optimal ranges will be in yellow when they are out of range. DHEA in conventional ranges is between 65 and 510. That's a pretty large range, by the way. And optimal ranges is 350 to 490. Again, that's the functional medicine ranges. Paul in 2022, where he is eating carbs, is at 79. Now, what is DHEA? So DHEA is a precursor hormone to sex hormones, and it's typically produced by the adrenal glands. Low levels suggest adrenal insufficiency or chronic stress. Oftentimes, when our DHEA is low, it's a sign of fatigue or being under stress. DHEA is produced primarily in the adrenals and is the most abundant circulating steroid in the human body and influences more than 150 known anabolic functions throughout the body and brain. It is the precursor for sex hormones, including testosterone, progesterone, and estrogen. And again, it's not flagged here because it's considered conventional ranges. He's at 79. Why? Especially when you are saying that after consuming 200 grams of carbohydrates is improving your hormones, allowing you to feel less stress in the body, but then explain the DHEA. When I see a DHEA this low, I always wonder what stress is going on in the body. And I usually look at the immune function, and we'll talk about that in a second. If 200 grams of carbohydrates is allowing Paul to feel less electrolyte imbalances or mineral imbalances and allowing him to feel less heart palpitations, that does not mean that the root cause of why those things were going on is now gone. When you consume carbohydrates, you retain more water. It is why people, when they eat carbs, they feel bloated. Oftentimes, that bloat is because for every glucose molecule, you are retaining water molecules. So when Paul eats carbs and feels less electrolyte imbalances and heart palpitations, I believe that because he's storing more water. But is the true root cause imbalance of those electrolytes healed from eating 200 grams of carbs? I don't think so, based on his blood work from 2024. But we'll get into that more in a second. So we now know, though, that his DHEA from 2022, when he started adding carbs and started feeling better, was low. And it is often indicative of a person that is under chronic stress and is possibly having adrenal insufficiency. It is from adrenals that you feel the cortisol imbalances that he is talking about, that he is faulting for a carnivore or ketogenic diet.
This is the most important piece of this blood work, is to show you guys the context. I am insulin sensitive and I eat a load of fruit and a lot of honey per day. How much? Today I think I've eaten an entire papaya. I've eaten close to an entire pineapple, and I've probably had 3 to 4 tablespoons of honey already today, and I haven't even eaten dinner. Now, dinner will probably be another 50 to 75 grams of carbohydrates, but that's a lot of carbohydrates that I've already ingested. What causes pathological insulin resistance? Seed oils and processed sugars. I think that can lead to some degree of insulin-induced insulin resistance, but also metabolic insulin resistance, metabolic dysfunction. And I think that you can eat a lot of raw honey and a lot of fruit and not develop insulin-induced insulin resistance.
Now, Paul brings up that most pathological insulin resistance is from processed sugars as well as seed oils. I will tell you that from the ketogenic space of anyone that does not eat carbohydrates or sugars, that I have seen markers consistently where their insulin and C-peptide will be low, even if they eat a little bit of seed oils. Now, I am not a proponent of seed oils, but I am saying I will see people eat ranch from the grocery store or go to restaurants and eat meats cooked in seed oils, and I will see that their insulin is still in a low range as long as they reduce the sugars. Now, Paul talks about how processed sugar can also cause insulin resistance. So let's talk honey. I will put all the sources in the show notes. Honey is the third most counterfeited food in the US. Tests reveal that 50 to 70% of US honey is fake or adulterated, including corn syrup, high fructose corn syrup equals processed sugar. 76% of grocery stores contained no pollen, which means fake honey, which means high fructose corn syrup. And also, Manuka honey is known to be so beneficial for your gut. And if it's real and raw, it can be. But if it's not, it can exacerbate the issues you're having in your gut. And 6 out of 7 Manuka honeys are fake. So if we talk about the risk of insulin resistance, I think you have a higher chance of having insulin resistance just by buying honey that is most likely fake.
Homocysteine. I want to talk about this one for one moment. Again, this may get a little complex here. Homocysteine is something I've talked about in the past. I've done entire podcasts on homocysteine and on MTHFR. I am Italian. I am homozygous for the 677 C to T polymorphism in the MTHFR gene, which is part of this methionine or folate cycle. You can see here dietary folate, not folic acid, that is not occurring in nature. It is tetrahydrofolate or methylfolate or adenosyl folate come in through the diet. And those of us, Italians, Hispanics, tend to have this polymorphism. This MTHFR enzyme doesn't work really well, or it works more slowly, which means we either need to get more folate into our bodies, or we need to find some source of L-methylfolate, or we need to get more riboflavin. So this is a really important thing. At the time of this blood work, I was traveling. I wasn't getting as much liver as I usually do. I wasn't eating as many egg yolks as I usually do. This is probably why my homocysteine bumped. The last few homocysteines I've seen have been 7 when I'm eating enough raw liver per day, an ounce, half an ounce a day. That keeps my homocysteine at 7 with no supplementation of L-methylfolate in my diet. Now, is homocysteine the end all and be all of the cardiovascular risk equation? No, it's not. We don't fully understand it, I don't think. But I think it is an important thing to know about. And if your homocysteine, I believe, is over 8, I would increase the amount of riboflavin in your diet. Where do you get riboflavin? Liver and heart are the best sources of riboflavin.
So I agree with Paul that homocysteine is an incredibly important marker to look at for inflammation. In our practice, if somebody has above a 7, maybe 7.5, 8, we will generally recommend a methylfolate only because we see that there's often a MTHFR mutation. And pro tip, I don't think it's that important to test your MTHFR. I would just get your homocysteine tested. If you have a high homocysteine, it is often because there is inflammation in the body. Even if you supplement, if it doesn't go down, it usually is indicative of inflammation. Methylfolate will reduce it, as you saw the pathway that Paul showed. But interestingly, dietary folate is only 30-ish% of that whole cycle. So whether you consume organ meats, it is usually not enough. And remember, he mentioned in 2022 that he was likely not eating enough organ meats, not enough egg yolks. So we'll see what happens with 2024.
I've also recently started experimenting with methylated B vitamins. I've spoken about in the past, and I'll speak about in this podcast, the fact that I have a MTHFR polymorphism and a couple other polymorphisms within the realm of methylation, including COMT, and that I generally feel better when I have a methylated B vitamin supplement, even if I'm eating half an ounce of liver per day. For many people, a methylated B vitamin supplement may not be necessary, especially if you don't have polymorphisms at your MTHFR gene.
I thought in 2022, his homocysteine was high because he wasn't eating the egg yolks as well as his organs, and that's why it was low, but typically it's within range. But now he's saying that he's added methylfolate because it makes him feel better. But if you're getting it from organs, why do you need the excess methylfolate? Unless the organs aren't giving you enough of the folate. Just saying. You can see that his folic acid is higher. And look, his homocysteine is still at 10. Okay, so just to recap, Paul mentioned that his homocysteine went up because he was not eating sufficient egg yolks as well as organ meats. But he also mentions that he started taking methylfolate, and you could see that increase in his 2024 markers. But his homocysteine is still high. If Paul is consuming organ meats as well as taking folate, as well as taking the niacin that he had recommended from, again, the organ meats. Why is his homocysteine high? And elevated homocysteine markers are usually because of inflammation and often points to deficiencies in B vitamins. So if Paul is consuming enough meat as well as consuming organ meats, there should be no reason nutritionally that Paul would be high in homocysteine. Even if Paul has the MTHFR mutation, supplementing methylfolate, his folate levels are taken care of. Now, homocysteine increases the risk of cardiovascular disease by causing damage to the endothelial lining of the arteries, especially in the heart.
Fruit juice, not inflammatory. I've shared many times in the past multiple studies corroborating the notion that fruit juice improves endothelial function. Fruit juice is not inflammatory. There are clear studies in humans showing that when you drink orange juice, the endothelium, the inside of your blood vessels, the lining of your blood vessels actually functions better.
It is interesting because Paul shares fruit juice supports endothelial function. So if Paul is drinking juice for support of endothelial function, I would also assume that his homocysteine would be going down. So all we can deduce from his lab markers is that yes, he is supplementing folate, but his homocysteine is still high, which is indicative of some inflammation somewhere in the body. And clearly, niacin is not cutting it.
At the time of this blood work, I was traveling. I wasn't getting as much liver as I usually do. And I wasn't eating as many egg yolks as I usually do. This is probably why my homocysteine bumped. The last few homocysteines I've seen have been 7 when I'm eating enough raw liver per day, an ounce, half an ounce a day. That keeps my homocysteine at 7 with no supplementation of L-methylfolate in my diet. Iron, this is an interesting one. So iron, there's a lot of iron in organs like liver and heart and muscle meat. My serum iron is normal. My ferritin is 177, totally normal, but probably in the middle of the range for most people. I'll go back to the July 2020 labs to show you guys my ferritin was 276. Don't know why it's 54 now. The ferritin is actually lower now. If you're a male, especially, you should know what's going on with your iron levels. I don't make any medical recommendations on the podcast, but I think that a lot of us males would feel better if our ferritin levels were less than 100. And doing regular phlebotomy has helped me get mine from as high as 332 down to now 69. It's been even lower than that at 50 or 30s in the past.
There are studies that show that if you donate blood, you can reduce your ferritin, which then reduces your risk of cardiovascular disease. In the functional wellness space, we really want to understand why it's imbalanced. Iron is what's in the blood, and then ferritin is the stored version of iron. So if we look at Paul's iron and ferritin levels over the years he's done blood work, there are imbalances that you cannot explain solely by the diet, nor does he try to explain it that way. And so the question is, why is that happening for Paul? You could see his iron. So the optimal ranges is 85 to 130, and it's not within range in 2020. So even when he was eating strict carnivore, he did not have enough iron in his blood. Why? When his ferritin levels, his stored form, is out of range even for conventional care. His 2022 iron levels are now higher, and actually on the other end, opposite end of being too high, and his ferritin is still out of range for the optimal ranges. Why? And in 2024 now, he shows that his iron is in 117, so that's now within range, and so is his ferritin, but he donated blood. Oftentimes, we will see decreased iron levels associated with iron deficiency anemia, which I don't think that's Paul, but also with hypochlorhydria, which is a sign of low stomach acid. Now, increased iron, which is 2022 when he was eating carbohydrates, it is also associated with liver dysfunction, hemochromatosis, and other infections. The ferritin, while we believe it's just that, our body is storing iron, why is his iron in his blood not in ideal ranges and it's on the lower end, yet he has so much stored iron, which we actually see this in our chronic illness patients. I don't want the community to just donate blood and not realize that there's actually an issue with their iron stores or iron levels. This is indicative of sometimes that there is inflammation. Sometimes high ferritin can be a marker of hypothyroid. Obviously, Paul's thyroid markers look good, so that's probably not the issue, but it is seen also high in CIRS or chronic inflammatory response syndrome because it can rise in response to infection or inflammation. It can also be high because of autoimmune and liver disease. So inflammation itself can impair the body's ability to properly use iron. The hormone hepcidin, which regulates iron absorption and releases from stores, is upregulated during inflammation. Hepcidin reduces the release of iron from stores such as ferritin and decreases iron absorption from the gut. This can lead to iron being sequestered, where the body holds onto the iron in the stores, so in ferritin, but it doesn't make it available for use. The question is, again, why? And if it's because of inflammation or infection, why? Because I don't think this is related to eating or not eating carbohydrates.
I don't think there's any evidence that eating carbohydrates in my diet in the form of fruit and honey, primarily with milk, is in any way, shape, or form harmful for me. There's really, as I said, no evidence for harm in my blood work of any of those things, despite the fact that a lot of people in the keto or carnivore space like to claim that there would be. There's absolutely no evidence in my blood work. And I would argue that this blood work that I have looks better than the blood work that I had when I was strict carnivore. The first thing you'll see here is that my fasting glucose is 89. Remember that I eat upwards of 300 grams of carbohydrates, primarily in the form of fruit and honey every day, and my fasting glucose is still very low. Even though people in the keto and carnivore space will say that eating low carb is beneficial for glucose, their fasting glucose is often quite high. Whether or not this represents a problem for humans, we're not entirely sure. And as I've said in the past, I fully respect anyone doing a keto or carnivore diet if that's what works best for you. Triglycerides 89, HDL 53. This is where these usually are in the last couple of years since I've been doing a animal-based diet.
Remember, Paul said that a good sign of insulin sensitivity is your HDL compared to your triglycerides. Now, Paul's 2024 labs show a decrease in his HDL and an increase in his triglycerides. So could that be signs of insulin resistance starting? As an example, his insulin went from 2.4 to 3.6, still in a very healthy range, especially even for optimal ranges. But if you go to his cholesterol, his triglycerides went from 65 to 89. That is a pretty big jump. And his HDL went from 66 to 53. He is now outside of the optimal ranges for HDL. How is that possible when he is consuming 2 pounds of meat a day? Unless the carbs are impacting his HDL.
I surf for 2 to 3 hours every morning. I do think that all humans benefit from some carbohydrates. Even if you're obese, even if you're diabetic, even if you're overweight, getting around 100 grams of carbohydrates a day minimum will lower stress hormones, things like cortisol, catecholamines, including epinephrine and norepinephrine. And they think that their cortisol to DHEAS ratio would be too high because the cortisol would be high and the DHEAS would be low. You can see here my cortisol is 12.5 random in the morning, and my DHEAS, that's DHEA sulfate, was 142. To give a ratio of 0.084 for my cortisol to DHEAS ratio. If you're interested in literature looking at this ratio, I'll share this study. Cortisol, DHEA sulfate, their ratio, and all-cause and cause-specific mortality in the Vietnam experience study. Basically, the authors say that this is one of the best ratios for longevity and predicting low rates of cause-specific mortality. I haven't heard anyone in the longevity space be willing to share theirs or talk about this ratio. So if you want to live a long time, keep your cortisol low and your DHEAS, which is an androgen, DHEA is dehydroepiandrosterone sulfate, keep that as high as possible.
Yes, you should keep it as high as possible or within the optimal ranges. So again, Paul's DHEA is at 142 now, which is an improvement since last time. I don't know if Paul supplements DHEA, but it went from 79 to 142. 142 is obviously so much better than 79, but it is still less than half of the ideal range for DHEA for a male And so his body still possibly, allegedly, has low adrenal function or some level of stress. So I put the DHEA next to cortisol so you can see a ratio is only as good as the numbers. So yes, while the ratio of Paul's cortisol to DHEA looks good, he is very out of range for DHEA in general. So the question again becomes, why is his DHEA low? Now, one thing we test in chronic inflammatory response syndrome is our DHEA marker because it is often low in people suffering from SIRS. It affects the DHEA as well as it affects testosterone. Now, Paul's testosterone looks within range, so I can't really say anything there, but his DHEA hormone may be low because his melanocyte stimulating hormone is low. Now, I would have Paul test his MSH to see if my theory is true. Again, these ratios look good, but if you're out of range, does the ratio really matter? Now, Paul is right that his blood sugar hasn't gone up a lot, but it has gone up a little bit. And so we'll have to see if over time it doesn't go up, but I'll give it to him. His blood sugar is still pretty good eating 300 grams of carbs. His insulin is going up. So we'll have to see how that continues. So while it's not a huge jump, it is going up. So we'll just have to see if this 300-gram carb diet is not impacting Paul in an adverse way.
I do think that all humans benefit from some carbohydrates, even if you're obese, even if you're diabetic, even if you're overweight. Getting around 100 grams of carbohydrates a day minimum will lower stress hormones.
So Paul believes that even if you are diabetic, if you are obese, if you have metabolic syndrome, so insulin resistance, that you should still support the body and consume 100 grams of carbs at the least. That would be 4 bananas a day, or maybe 5 cups of blueberries, or 6 tablespoons of honey. If you could handle 4 bananas a day or 5 cups of blueberries and you didn't fall off the wagon, then maybe it would be okay, assuming that you wore a continuous glucose monitor and your blood sugar was still within the normal healthy range, even if you had momentary spikes of maybe 20 to 30 milligrams per deciliter. But most people are not able to handle it. 4 bananas becomes banana cream pie. Or maybe I don't want to eat a banana today. I am going to have banana cream pie and I'll just keep it under 100 grams. For somebody that is insulin resistant, that will make them more hungry because they cannot access the fuel. And then that will trigger a hunger response and they will want more food. Our goal when you are insulin resistant or having too much insulin is to lower the insulin so that then you're not hangry all the time. So when you recommend for somebody that is metabolically unwell to at least consume 100 grams of carbs, I'm sorry, but I think it is irresponsible, especially when most people that are insulin resistant and have weight on them, trust me, I work with many of them and they suffer from dieting their whole life and under eating. And when they try to change their way of eating, it is so hard because their body is working against them. But when they are eating a carnivore diet, their insulin for the first time is finally going down enough that they are not hangry. They are finally having a reduction of cortisol so they could get nutrients in their system. Their immune system gets to relax because there's less inflammatory foods coming in, and they are starting to heal the body so that the fat cells can reduce the toxins or storing of the toxins so that they can start healing. So again, if you worked with people one-on-one, you would know these dilemmas and know that it is not prudent to recommend to be eating this many carbs. If you want to recommend a temporary snack, such as a keto food, so that they can heal, they can reduce their insulin, then maybe one day they can eat the banana or 2. But to tell a society that is mostly overweight and half of the country is diabetic to eat carbs is probably not the most ideal thing to say.
I will mention that AST and ALT are indications of liver function and or liver irritation. The other one to consider is getting a GGT. I have seen some people on ketogenic and carnivore diets see their AST and ALT go up, and I don't think that should be ignored. It does suggest that the liver is working harder than it would like to be, but as you can see, my AST and ALT are totally normal.
These are liver enzymes that are indicative of possible inflammation. As you see, Paul in 2020, when he was eating mostly carnivore, if not only carnivore, his AST was still high, which normally you don't see it that high. I normally see the AST on carnivore diets in the low 20s or in the teens. So it is very odd that his marker was at 32. In 2024, it is at 30. So AST can be increased with damage to the liver cells. It could be indicative of some levels of liver disease or medications or heart problems and pancreatitis. But for some reason, Paul's AST not terribly high, but you can see even compared to conventional ranges, it is pretty up there. Now, his ALT is within range, and if that is high, it's normally related to fatty liver, but it isn't super low. This is still within range, so not terribly worried, but I often see this lower in carnivore clients and patients.
My kidneys work just fine. Go figure.
I don't know if Paul's kidneys are working just fine. Let's look at the details of Paul's kidney markers. He shares that his eGFR is 63. So the BUN or BUN looks pretty within range. The creatinine it's actually a little bit out of range, but it's normal if you're eating a little bit of high protein. But his eGFR is 63. So this is from the National Kidney Foundation of what should be a normal GFR for people without chronic kidney disease. And so I think Paul's in the 40 to 49. So his eGFR should at least be 99 and his GFR is 63. Paul's 2022 was 82, which is still on the lower end for Paul. And this is again when he's eating carbs. And in 2024, it is 63. He can say that he was not drinking enough water, but I don't think from all of the different markers that are imbalanced, that is the only reason. A level below 90 is indicative of a mild loss of kidney function. And if you go back to the National Kidney Foundation's ranges, he is well below the normal ranges. And so I would not consider Paul's kidneys, the markers, to be ideal.
Interestingly, my SHBG is 68. My last sex hormone binding globulin was 54 or 56, I believe. But when you dig into SHBG, what you find is that perhaps this is not something you always check when you are fasting. This is one blood draw that I did when I was fasting because I had to get fasting lipids. But SHBG is probably something you should check when you are not fasting. Now, why is that? Because insulin lowers sex hormone binding globulin. This is why my sex hormone binding globulin was very high when I did a ketogenic diet. It's been as high as 112 or 120, which led to free testosterone levels that were significantly lower than what I had now. Again, yet another reason that I'm not a huge fan of ketogenic diets. Your SHBG will likely skyrocket because you need some insulin to drive that down. Here, Bloodwork collected 226 2024, 8:30 in the morning. That is a fasting blood draw. That's important that you understand that.
So Paul's SHBG is 68, which is out of range for even conventional ranges. And then in 2024, it's 57. So it is out of range for optimal. So Paul mentioned that in 2022, he learned that you should not be fasting because insulin should be activated to lower SHBG. And so when you test for SHBG, you should be eating or non-fasting. Yet Paul was fasting during 2024, and yet his SHBG went down. So low insulin can increase higher SHBG levels, but other things can too. But SHBG is produced in the liver, and liver dysfunction can influence SHBG production. So if liver enzymes are only slightly elevated, this can suggest stress that is playing a role in SHBG. Iron levels on the higher side can also contribute to liver stress and cause the SHBG levels to change. Elevated homocysteine, which Paul's homocysteine is elevated at 10 point something, and it is a marker of inflammation. And this can also impact the liver as well as the endocrine or your hormones, your adrenals, and increase your SHBG. Low DHEA suggests a degree of adrenal fatigue or dysfunction, which can shift the balance of sex hormones, including testosterone and estrogen, and indirectly cause SHBG to rise. Lower DHEA might reflect a body under stress, reducing anabolic hormones and increasing SHBG in response. So, all to say, it is likely that Paul's SHBG was not just because of the carnivore diet, and it could be a lot of these other factors that can also cause SHBG to rise. Now, maybe on a carnivore diet, Paul was under eating fat and under eating calories, overly fasting, and that can increase your SHBG. But if he was eating an adequate amount of fat and protein on a carnivore diet, his SHBG should not be going up that much. So the question is, could Paul have a little bit of liver inflammation, which also can impact SHBG?
The rest of the comprehensive metabolic panel are electrolytes, quote unquote. You see sodium, potassium, chloride, calcium, etc. Most people are not going to have derangements in these electrolytes, though I have seen some people have their sodium dip when they're limiting salt.
So Paul is right where your CMP ideally should rarely be imbalanced. Your body will only have it imbalanced when it's not doing so well. If you think about the blood as a highway and it's always trying to be in homeostasis, then it will always try to regulate your electrolytes to be in better balance. But that does not mean that your cells have the right electrolyte balances. That's where other tests are more beneficial to see if a 3-month cell status shows true balances of electrolytes and electrolyte function. I need you to really understand this. When we do blood work, even if you just get a typical physical or wellness check from your doctor, they will always include a CBC, which is a complete blood count. And it's basically what your blood cells are doing. It also shares immune function, infections, viral, bacterial loads, anemia, and any other blood related conditions. It is in doing the CBC that if there's anything imbalanced, that then more testing will be done to see if there's anemia or if there is cancer. Now, just a pro tip, CMPs are also tested, and that's the liver kidney function electrolyte. It does not include A1C insulin, so you will have to do that additionally. Now, in the CBC, as part of the immune function, we test these blood cells or white blood cells. And a lot of them is to obviously reduce inflammation and be a defense against any foreign invaders. Now, this matters because of Paul's 2022 CBC immune health markers.
As you can see here, basically all of the metrics on my complete blood count are within normal. There's nothing crazy to point out here. I don't have any current infections going on, so my white blood cell count is not elevated. My red blood cell count is within normal. My hematocrit is actually pretty darn high, something that has to do with my iron levels, probably, and just the fact that I'm an athlete. Everything else here is normal, and I won't go into tons of detail.
Now, Paul doesn't really bring up anything other than his immune cells or immune system looks good, but let's look at his monocytes. You see also the lymphocytes as well as the neutrophils and the eosinophils. Now, he does bring up the red blood cells and how this marker is elevated. And I believe he also brings up hematocrit and that it was likely that he was dehydrated. And so some of the markers may be imbalanced. Now, remember, these markers, again, are the standard ranges. I wanted to share a study on the standard care percentage of monocytes. Now, monocytes are white blood cells that are the body's second line of defense against infection. Chronically elevated monocytes often point to a persistent infection, chronic inflammation, or an immune system that's continuously activated. This might warrant further investigation, including viral, bacterial, or autoimmune conditions. In 2020, shared that his marker was 8.5. In 2022, it was 8.9. In 2024, it's actually at 10 now. If you look at this specific study, the normal white blood cell distribution is based on these percentages. So for every single human being, within even the standard range, monocytes should be between 2 to 8%, eosinophils 1 to 4, basophils 0.5 to 1. So for monocytes, anything above an 8 is out of range, even for standard care. For some reason, Paul's monocytes above 8 is not flagged as out of range. But if you see, it is out of range in 2020 when he was closer to strict carnivore, and then it was out of range in 2022, which I think is indicative of why maybe carnivore didn't work enough. So these markers, all of these markers are part of that CBC. His total white blood count is within range. He does mention in 2020 that he might have been sick from over exercising. So we'll give him that for why it's low. In 2022 and 2024, they are within range. Now, his RBC has always been out of range, and now it's fully out of the conventional range. So these RBCs carry oxygen to the lungs and to the rest of the tissues to get basically oxygen. Increased levels are associated with dehydration, maybe stress, a need for vitamin C. Probably not that because Paul eats a lot of fruit, and respiratory diseases such as asthma. Now, he could say it's because he's an athlete or that he's dehydrated, but it might also be because he's stressed or there's some type of stress in his body. His hemoglobin is actually out of range, and it is close to out of range for the conventional ranges. Again, hemoglobin helps to carry oxygen. Hematocrit, he has himself said, is high. And so there would be a need for more testing for Paul to figure out what is going on. A high hematocrit with a high RBC and high hemoglobin can indicate polycythemia. It is a disease state in which the proportion of blood volume is occupied by red blood cell increases. Now, it could be that he surfs and holds his breath as he says, but I would not bet the farm on that. His MCV and RDW look within range. Now, RDW is an interesting one. You want this marker to be low. So the more that the marker is low is saying that all of your red blood cells are all the same sizes. The more that this distribution or the sizes are different is a sign that there is abnormal variations, which can be indicative of illness. So for Paul, he is out of range all the time. Now, it can be a deficiency in B12, folic acid, iron, anemia. So again, it's those questions of how come you have to supplement methylfolate? Even if it's the MTHFR, why is it still imbalanced, especially with your homocysteine? Your iron, maybe you're not anemic, but why is your iron imbalanced that you have to donate blood? Higher levels can also be a sign of inflammation or poor nutrient absorption. Remember, we had a marker that showed hypochlorhydria, which is low stomach acid. Higher percentages may indicate more variation, and it can also mean that the liver is not functioning as ideal as it should.
I don't think there's any evidence that eating carbohydrates in my diet in the form of fruit and honey, primarily with milk, is in any way, shape, or form harmful for me. There's really, as I said, no evidence for harm in my blood work of any of those things, despite the fact that a lot of people in the keto or carnivore space like to claim that there would be. There's absolutely no evidence in my blood work. And I would argue that this blood work that I have looks better than the blood work that I had when I was strict carnivore. As you can see here, basically all of the metrics on my complete blood count are within normal. There's nothing crazy to point out here. I don't have any current infections going on, so my white blood cell count is not elevated. My red blood cell count is within normal. My hematocrit is actually pretty darn high, something that has to do with my iron levels, probably, and just the fact that I'm an athlete. Everything else here is normal, and I won't go into tons of detail.
The most interesting part is his immune cells. Now, his neutrophils were very out of range in 2020, and then the monocytes were clearly out of range. But in 2022, it is still out of range, and 2024, it is still out of optimal ranges. Neutrophils are the white blood cells used by the body to combat bacterial infections. Now, remember the monocytes, but monocytes, again, are the body's second line of defense. And it could be a persistent infection, chronic inflammation, or an immune system that's constantly activated. And if you see, Paul's 2024 is worse than it ever has been. So even if Paul is feeling great and his testosterone's all within range, his markers are not trending in the most ideal way. Even if we were to compare the monocytes, eosinophils, and basophils to the standard care ranges, he is out of range even in 2024. He is at 10 when the distribution of monocytes should be at 8%. So with RDWs, you want this marker to be low. Now, Paul takes folate, so obviously then that's not the reason for this. Or can it be related to the iron, which remember, Paul manipulates by giving away blood? These questions are asking, why is Paul having these imbalances? If the body has its own wisdom, why is it not balancing on his own? So why, if Paul is feeling better, is his monocytes going up? So while Paul is sharing that his blood work and his health feels much better on 300 grams of carbohydrates, there are still imbalances that have been there since 2020 or has been there since 2022, and it's still there in 2024. So the question is why? Because I don't think the answer is carbohydrates or not.
Insulin is a valuable hormone. Having an after meal, a postprandial spike in your insulin does so many good things for your body. It helps your body conserve minerals, it helps your body conserve electrolytes. This is why people on long-term ketogenic diets often run into recalcitrant electrolyte deficiencies, and no amount of salt or electrolyte supplementation will correct them. I've seen this over and over and over. Giving your body some insulin is a good thing. Insulin is not the enemy. With healthy kidneys, I should be able to excrete any excess of sodium from my diet just fine. But one of the problems that I ran into on a ketogenic diet many years ago was that no matter how much salt I ate, I could not hold on to my electrolytes.
Let's talk about the electrolytes. So we can safely say that there are possibly some imbalances in Paul's blood work, even though they weren't flagged. Even some markers that are out of range for standard care ranges. I have no idea why they're not flagged on Paul's labs, but you can see that they are out of range. He talks about electrolytes and how protein is insulinogenic, and it is. If you eat a lot of protein, you will see your blood sugars go up. What's interesting is that Paul tested his osmolality, and osmolality being low shows dehydration is not the case for Paul. Low osmolality typically indicates there's an excessive amount of fluid within the body for some reason. Now, I know this isn't flagged on Paul's because they say the range is 265 to 320, but this is actually low. And so even though Paul doesn't feel his electrolyte imbalances, Paul is still imbalanced, most likely, with his electrolytes. And by the way, we check this marker for SIRS because it is often imbalanced with SIRS. So low osmolality typically indicates there's an excessive amount of fluid within the body. The most common reason for this result is that a person has pushed fluids for some reason over the last 72 hours. Now, high osmolality indicates dehydration. Paul's marker is low. Now, these are some of the reasons why osmolality can be low, including overhydration, antidiuretic hormone imbalances, which is something I would strongly encourage Paul to test. It could be thyroid related, which it most likely isn't based on Paul's markers, and then adrenal insufficiency, which we see that is cortisol as well as DHEA is on the lower side. So could it be related to that? So if Paul's osmolality is low, I recommend testing the antidiuretic hormone. And then if that marker is imbalanced, a imbalance that is beyond just having to supplement carbs or supplementing electrolytes, and it is more related to a hormonal imbalance that can be impacted by either infections, environment, other things that don't have to do with the diet. The antidiuretic hormone is released by your pituitary, which also impacts your thyroid. When you are eating carbohydrates, since your body is full of water, you do not realize the restless leg syndrome or the heart palpitations because there is more fluid in the system. But that does not mean that your electrolytes are balanced. That is why people that eat a bunch of carbs still have heart attacks because they find out their magnesium is super low. In Paul's case, his osmolality, even when consuming 300 grams of carbohydrates, is low, meaning that he still has electrolyte issues. So I would strongly encourage Paul to test his ADH and see if there is a hormonal imbalance that is causing his electrolytes to be imbalanced, and not that it is because he ate too little carbs, which then reduced the insulin, which then didn't allow for his kidneys to retain water, to retain the electrolytes. In fact, ADH is the hormone that goes up when you're sleeping so that you don't wake up to go pee. And so a lot of times you'll see the ADH go down in people that have chronic inflammation and illness. So I just wonder what Paul's ADH marker is when his osmolality is low. Let me share a study on osmolality. Obviously, Paul is not on dialysis. They found that when osmolality is low, there's an inhibition of phagocyte function. And phagocytes is a type of immune cell that digests harmful particles, bacteria, and dead or dying cells to protect the body. In low osmolality dialysis fluids, phagocyte function can be impaired, reducing immune responses. Could Paul's low osmolality and his imbalanced white blood cells be indicative of some type of infection or some type of illness that is not related to carbs or not? I wanted to mention two other markers that I kind of just breezed through. So CO2 is the carbon dioxide. It can be low on a ketogenic diet because of ketones being more acidic, but Paul is not on a ketogenic diet. So why is Paul's markers out of range? And in fact, it is technically even almost out of range for conventional ranges. Anion gap is also similar because it is a calculation of electrolytes in the blood, and it can be higher on a ketogenic diet again because ketones are more acidic. But why is Paul's out of range when he is not ketogenic? Increased levels are often associated with the thiamine deficiency, which is vitamin B1, that is the richest in pork, Paul, and in metabolic acidosis. Now, actually, this should not even be yellow. It should be this orange color. So why is Paul's anion gap out of range? I don't know, because he is not on a ketogenic diet. Why is this out of range for Paul? There might be an imbalance that is deeper than consuming carbs or not. If Paul was my client or patient, here are some things that I would suggest. I am not giving medical advice. So stress from carnivore was likely not because of a reduction in insulin. Currently, his DHEA is still low, his SHBG is still high, and he also had a little bit of low potassium, which if he's eating a ton of fruits, I don't know why his potassium is low unless his body is not able to hold it. And not eating higher fat carnivore likely uncovered Paul's root cause deficiencies. And instead of trying to find those root cause answers, Paul felt that it was just an electrolyte imbalance, but that probably isn't the reason, and why this new diet, this 300 grams of carbs diet, is not fully fixing his blood work. I would again test his antidiuretic hormone. Could 300 grams of carbohydrates and water retention be masking an imbalance? It's also likely not dehydration, as Paul mentioned, because the bun is higher and the albumin is not high, but the osmolality is low. The anion gap of Paul's is high, which can be common in keto, but Paul is not keto. So there is some type of metabolic imbalance somewhere and specific to minerals. Paul has low DHEA, which can mean that he is under stress or low adrenal function. His AM cortisol has dropped as well. And yes, his cortisol to DHEA ratio is good, but his absolute numbers are not in an ideal place. So why does his DHEA look bad when Paul says he feels so great? So Paul's A1C and glucose did look better when first starting his pro-metabolic diet, or the 200 grams or 300 grams of carbs. His insulin is going up and his HDL went down, as well as his triglycerides are going up. So there are small symptoms of insulin resistance possibly starting to trend that way. But initially, I think when he started eating carbs, his insulin was working really well and it shoveled it into his muscles as well as his liver. But now that he's been eating this way longer, could it mean that there will be imbalances over time? Who knows? Paul does surf for 3 hours, so I'm sure that is helping him a ton. Paul's iron and ferritin levels are imbalanced, so I would test for further inflammation. I would test the inflammatory markers from the innate side, not just the adaptive side. Adaptive side is HSCRP or C-reactive protein. The innate side is the TGF beta 1, MMP9, C3 or C4a, VEGF. These are all markers of inflammation, and I would love for Paul to share them. Donating may actually cause further iron issues. For some people, even if they have high ferritin, it could still be that they are anemic, and maybe the body is holding on to excess iron because of some reason it's trying to balance the body. I highly recommend figuring out the root cause instead of just band-aiding by donating blood. Raw milk obviously helps to also reduce those ferritin levels. There's an article you can look up, blood donations and risk of cardiovascular heart disease in men. Methylfolate for MTHFR. Folate levels look within range, but the homocysteine is still high even when Paul is taking folate. So there is likely some inflammation somewhere. Now, given the fact that Paul has an ApoE3 and MTHFR gene, it's probably not ideal to flood the body with glucose. It is an expensive, long-term, consequential band-aid. I would also have Paul consider hydrochloric acid or digestive bitters. His chloride was low, which is needed for stomach acid production. Hydrochloric acid, chloride, you sort of need those. His alkaline phosphatase is trending low, which then can be indicative that he needs more zinc. You need zinc to produce more hydrochloric acid. So yes, there are subclinical and even not subclinical, but just not flagged markers on Paul's labs that share with me as a functional medicine practitioner that he is struggling with something. And it is not related to carbs or not. And this conversation was so important to share because it is not about the carnivore diet. I know that Paul really wants to believe it, and I know that he really believes it. I fully believe that he believes it, but I don't think it's the case. And I hope that Paul figures out what is imbalanced, what is wrong, so that he can find more healing. Now, while we're talking about Paul, I wanted to touch upon how Paul uses studies to show why he is right with his hypotheses, especially when it comes to fructose and carnivore. I wanted to show you an example of how you can pretty much use any study to prove just about anything.
The effects of natural honey consumption in diabetic patients, an 8-week randomized clinical trial. This couldn't possibly be good for diabetics, except body weight, total cholesterol, low density lipoprotein, and triglycerides decreased, and high density lipoprotein cholesterol increased significantly in the honey group. Isn't that amazing? But the trigs going down, HDL going up, and body weight going down suggests that it's going in the right direction. A1C going up means that in diabetic patients, if you eat honey, it's going to affect your blood sugar levels. No sh**. But you're going to get metabolically healthy or healthier. It didn't make them less metabolically healthy. It made them more metabolically healthy. I don't think honey is a great thing for diabetics because your metabolic health is already broken. Don't eat a lot of honey. But I think the study illustrates the fact that you can give diabetics honey and they get more metabolically healthy. Their blood sugar goes up, of course.
Now, this does not share what happened with their insulin levels. So in the video, Paul shares that the A1C going up is normal because they are diabetic. But even if their blood lipids improved and their body weight went down, how does their insulin look? How do other markers look? It is not just about the blood lipids or the body weight. So this is not the best study to recommend people that are diabetic to consume honey. Now, you can also get a CGM or do blood work and include honey and see if it improves your health or not. But again, 70% of honey is adulterated.
The effect of fructose on body weight in controlled feeding trials, a systemic review and meta-analysis. Fructose does not seem to cause weight gain when it is substituted for other carbohydrates in diets providing similar calories. Free fructose at high doses that provided excess calories, modestly increased body weight. Imagine that.
Now, Paul shared this fructose study meta-analysis. Now, meta-analysis studies will only be as good as the individual studies in the meta-analysis. Now, this study, if you follow me, now this study, the effects of fructose on body weight in controlled feeding studies, it is the same study as this one. John Sivan Piper. Now the disclosures, if you look right here, Dr. Sivan Piper receives money from Coca-Cola, and then more Coca-Cola and Kellogg's and Dannon. So these were the disclosures. The Coca-Cola company, Coca-Cola, part owner and director of Glycemic Index Labs, Kellogg's. So I don't know if this study is kind of biased. I'll just leave it at that. In 2024, Paul shares this video.
There are clear studies in humans showing that when you drink orange juice, the endothelium, the inside of your blood vessels, the lining of your blood vessels actually functions better.
Now, they hypothesized that the regular intake of red orange juice has short-term favorable effects on the endothelial function of subjects with increased cardiovascular risk, probably as a consequence of the reduction of the oxidative stress or an anti-inflammatory properties. The study was with 31 people. The cardiovascular risk people were 19, and then there was a control of 12. They drank 7 days of the red orange juice. The red orange juice was filtered and pasteurized, FYI. And they then took a 3-day break, and then they drank the 7 days of placebo juice, which was water, orange aroma, basically a mixture of fake stuff. And they hypothesized that the benefits were attributed to antioxidants and vitamin C. It was not about blood sugar or insulin impacts, and they did not even really discuss that. So these were the findings. You see in the cardiovascular risk group, their basal starting of their CRP, it does look like the orange reduced it. So from 3.6 to 2.0, and then the IL-6, which is an inflammatory marker, went down. But if you look at the placebo, it also goes down with that as well. And they also noted that the improvements was mostly in men. Now, this was only in 1 week of drinking. So what happens after they drink it for 2 weeks? Like Paul, eating carbs for 2 years, some of the markers have gotten a little bit worse. So could these people that have cardiovascular risk drinking juice for more than 1 week, could the markers have gone worse? The placebo drink also had improvements. The CRP went down with just this crappy drink as well, and so did the interleukin 6. Obviously, the red orange juice did improve a lot more. So if we do think it's the benefits of all of these antioxidants and vitamin C, why couldn't we take some of these from foods that are not rich in sugar? Just a thought. Now, I'm going to have you consider a few things about this study. First of all, a lot of these nutrients or antioxidants can degrade once the juice is pasteurized. Vitamin C, as an example, is one of the most heat-sensitive vitamins and can degrade during pasteurization, up to 10 to 30%. Polyphenols can also reduce by 20 to 30%. Carotenoids ideally converts to vitamin A. Prolonged high treatments can reduce their bioavailability. Now, polyphenols can bind to minerals, zinc, iron, and calcium. They can also cause gut issues such as bloat, gas, and diarrhea. And here are some of the studies. So CPMs are carotenoids, polyphenols, and minerals. And it says, based on current findings, CWPs can inhibit the bioaccessibility of CPMs in the gastrointestinal tract. So the cell wall polysaccharides can impact the absorption of these CPMs. And another review of antioxidant mechanisms of polyphenols compounds related to iron binding. They can actually bind to your iron. So our polyphenols, which can technically be considered an anti-nutrient, but in the plant-based world considered an antioxidant, is it such a good thing? Carotenoids are the form that we cannot absorb in the human body. So we consume them, and then the body is supposed to convert it into vitamin A. For some people with certain genes, they are not able to do that conversion. Now, I've talked about vitamin A in detail, but I will not talk about it a ton here. But we get excess of vitamin A in the body, especially when we are consuming foods like this. Just to let you know, the daily upper limit means it is not ideal to go over this amount. And for beef liver, for 1 ounce, you can see how much you are going over. You can look at this in a lot more detail in the citations and sources I share in the show notes. And pro tip, liver is a detox organ. So you can see how it happens. Toxins come through with the lungs, skin, and gut. And then it's supposed to exit through skin, kidneys, colon, and lungs. But it is in the liver that the detoxification thing happens. If the excess toxins do not get excreted, it gets stored in the body in fat cells, bone marrow, liver, central nervous system. And then it could even have an effect on your joints, bloods, tissue, and muscles. So the side effects are this on the side, these signs of toxicity, which is pretty much everything. All to say that if you eat liver or organs, I highly recommend eating the grass-finished organic varieties so that you are getting the cleanest versions, because you don't know what time they are processing the animal and what part of the detoxification process the liver was going through. I personally don't recommend liver at all unless someone is super deficient in something, but usually we can find that nutrient in some other food. As we've discussed on this conversation, folate is not something that you will replete by consuming liver or organ meats. And if it's because of vitamin A, there are many other foods that you can consume that are rich in vitamin A. If it's copper, you can get that from seafood. I can go on with these nutrients. So hesperidin is an antioxidant, and they found that excess doses might cause oxidative stress and increase the risk of inflammation, especially if taken in longer periods. Now, there's all these nuances about how much hesperidin can cause issues. One study showed that potential toxicity is at 100 milligrams. One single orange has 50 milligrams. Obviously, rats are way smaller than humans, but you get the point but too much hesperidin can be not ideal in cases too. Anthocyanins also elevates plasma homocysteine in rats. High intake of anthocyanins may increase plasma homocysteine levels, which is a risk for cardiovascular disease. Again, these levels were isolated, given to rats and rodents. Paul said rodent studies are fair, so it's on the table. All of these antioxidants does not mean it's super beneficial. Another study shows that high anthocyanin levels may not provide significant short-term health effects, and there are no major effects in inflammation or oxidative stress markers for the short term. You can also get these antioxidants in other foods such as black beans, eggplants, cabbage, leaf lettuce, which are less in fructose levels. And if you are diabetic, drinking a cup of orange juice is probably not the smartest thing. And what you could do is check your blood sugar before drinking that orange juice, drink it on an empty stomach, and then try it again and see where your blood sugar goes up. Now, antioxidants, taking too much of it, that it can actually cause pro-oxidants and cause more inflammation. So this review aims to examine the double-edged effects of dietary originating antioxidants with the focus on the most abundant compounds, polyphenols, vitamin C, vitamin E, carotenoids, and it shares that in excess, it can actually cause inflammation. So we only need antioxidants if we have a lot of inflammation in the body, and it's the antioxidants that would pull the inflammation and remove it from the system. If you're consuming a carnivore diet or reducing the overall inflammation in the body, why do you even need a ton of antioxidants? I bring that whole conversation and argument up in Carnivore Cure, but it's just something to think about when we say that orange juice is so good because of the vitamin C and the antioxidants, but you cannot out vitamin C the level of glucose in orange juice. And I got that saying from Dr. Robert Lustig. Okay, here's another study, review on antioxidants, pro-oxidants, and the related controversies. High doses of antioxidants can act as pro-oxidants. Many dietary antioxidants, such as flavonoids, vitamin C, even carotenoids, can exhibit pro-oxidant behavior, depending on factors like their concentration and the presence of transition metals, such as iron and copper. Liver is super high in iron and copper. Look at the level of copper, 1,089% of your daily value in 3.5 ounces of beef liver. In such cases, instead of neutralizing free radicals, antioxidants may promote the production of reactive oxygen species, which can cause oxidative damage to cells and tissues. So for the people consuming orange juice and fruits with beef liver, it might not be the best thing. All of those studies was supposed to be facetious. I was just trying to prove that if the orange juice is supposed to help these people reduce their inflammatory markers of hsCRP or interleukin 6, there are arguments with the antioxidants, vitamin C, that are in the orange juice. And again, the study does not go after blood glucose, insulin, and any of these other markers. I don't think drinking a little bit of orange juice is the end of the world, but I was just trying to prove and show you can prove your case by finding any study to support you. Now, studies are the ideal way to get evidence-based research, but it is also important to see it in clinical practice. We have worked with over 2,000 carnivore clients and patients, and we have done a ton of blood work and functional tests, and we know that sometimes ferritin is high in people. We also see thyroid markers a little bit lower than standard care ranges, and it may be okay. It is that nuance and context that matters. And so when studies show a level of theory and results, but if it doesn't work, when the rubber hits the road, when you have clients and patients in front of you and the things don't work, then it doesn't matter. It is more important what we see in clinical cases. And that's when you can learn that some things that you hypothesize may not be true and may not be working. Now, I want to leave you with a couple recommendations for you because, what do you do with all this information? Paul says one thing, I say something different. Other people in the wellness space say other things. So what do you follow? And so here's what I recommend. When you start a diet, get blood work before any new diet, and then, or any changes in your diet, and then get blood work 90 days after. Usually we recommend 90 days because your red blood cells typically live for 90 days. So you sort of want to see how the changes happen after 90 days. And if you could get somebody that understands functional medicine or optimal ranges of lab work, that would be more ideal. And then understand it from a carnivore perspective, because even in optimal ranges, LDL being high would be flagged. But obviously, we know in our ketogenic carnivore space that LDL can be high, but I want to then look at your HDL and your triglycerides. If your T3 is low, I also want to look at your TSH and your iodine levels. There are so many things I look at other than if you are eating carbs or not. Additionally, I would take a list, an inventory of a pros and cons list. What are some of your non-scale victories that you are gaining? And those things are very real. It is easy to forget all the things you struggled with when starting a diet and only focus on what is not working. But if you have a list, it will keep things in perspective. And no one knows your body as much as you. So that is where a food and mood journal is so important. I will put one in the show notes. Tracking your symptoms is so key to see. Maybe your joint pain isn't fully gone, but if it went from a 10 level of pain to a 5, that is still a win. And you keep going, then maybe it could go from a 5 to a 1. That is why tracking is so important, and trusting your own body. Don't trust me. Don't trust Paul. Trust your own body and its innate wisdom. Your body has an innate ability to tell you or share with symptomologies that something is imbalanced. Trust that. And sometimes, like Paul, maybe the electrolytes are imbalanced, but dig a little deeper. If the carbs are not fully fixing it, and I'm sure that Paul probably has some level of symptoms, but you may want to look into it deeper. Like, why do you need to donate blood? Why do you need to get on methylfolate? I understand you have MTHFR and you just feel better with lower ferritin, but why? Those are some things that you should consider, because that is trusting your own body and trusting in the innate wisdom and not just trusting labs. You know, the thing is that fear sells. I don't think that everyone should not eat fruit based on the studies I shared, but if your body can tolerate fruit physically and emotionally, then maybe you can eat a little bit of fruit. But most people don't live near the equator and swim for 3 hours or surf for 3 hours and live a life like Paul. Paul is metabolically healthy, and he has been even when starting the carnivore diet. So most people are metabolically unwell. And so most people are unlike Paul. You know, have grace for yourself. Not everybody has to do carnivore. Not everybody has to add fruit. Be honest with yourself. Trust yourself. And if you need a carnivore diet, don't fear it. We have worked with enough people. There was never a person that we had to say, you should stop the carnivore diet. It is making you sick. It is ruining your hormones. Yes, if you undereat, you can ruin your hormones, but you can ruin your hormones with any diet. It's just that when your insulin is a lot higher on standard American diets, you feel hangry. So it is an uncontrolled way of eating. But on a carnivore diet, you just have to make sure you eat enough, you eat sufficiently, you make sure to drink enough water so that you are removing the waste products from eating protein. But overall, trust the process, have grace, and don't fear a diet that ancestrally animals were always on the table. And I don't know why now we think eating 300 grams of fruits, which would be 12 bananas, that is not ancestrally consistent. And even if you eat 8 bananas at 200 grams, that is not ancestrally consistent. If we reduce the blood sugar levels, even if sugar is not the culprit of your metabolic syndrome, it works. And we've seen it time and time again. And sometimes when you eat a carnivore diet and you are so strict and you're not fully getting better after a while, it's not because these miraculous stories on the internet are fake. It's probably because you need support beyond the diet. Illness is not just related to a diet. I really wish it was. But for a lot of people, when carnivore doesn't work enough and you've been sick for a long time, usually there's more under the hood. And that's why we work with some of the most chronically ill where carnivore doesn't fully fix them enough. And they could have gone the Paul Saladino route of fruit and honey. And trust me, some of them have, and it doesn't work enough. So I hope what you take from this conversation is that I think Paul was wrong. It was never his diet. I believe that the diet didn't work for him, but it wasn't the diet, but more that he was uncovering more root cause issues of his imbalances. I hope Paul gets to even better health and use his gifts and talents to help people get to true optimal health without fear mongering a carnivore diet. Paul, you are talented. You are able to be charismatic. Use those gifts and help people to heal. Okay, guys, make sure to eat a lot of meat. Take care of your bodies because it is the only place you have to live. I will talk to you later. Bye, guys.
The last thing I'll say before we start looking at the blood work is that I really appreciate it when other people in the health space share their own blood work. And it's something that I see happen very rarely. In fact, I can't think of very few people in the keto space, in the low carb space that I've ever seen share their blood work. I'll talk about why in this podcast and some things that I think might not look good on your blood work if you're low carb, like thyroid or testosterone, sex hormone binding globulin, et cetera. But I would love to see some of the people who argue that a low carb diet is better than including carbohydrates in your diet share their blood work.
I shared my 5-year carnivore blood work in April of 2022. The article's listed below. And again, it'll be in the sources. And I also did a YouTube video on my 6-year carnivore blood work.
I don't think there's any evidence that eating carbohydrates in my diet in the form of fruit and honey, primarily with milk, is in any way, shape, or form harmful for me. There's really, as I said, no evidence for harm in my blood work of any of those things, despite the fact that a lot of people in the keto or carnivore space like to claim that there would be. There's absolutely no evidence in my blood work.